Our planet was once a world of bare rock and dust. Today, it is a green world, a planet of forests. The story of that transformation is one of Earth's greatest mysteries. It was not a single event, but a profound revolution that reshaped the land, the sky, and the very future of life. The evidence for this epic change is not found in history books, but locked within rare and ancient fossil forests. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the precise moment Earth turned green and why that shift was so powerful it altered the planet's atmosphere forever. We will uncover the biological innovations that made it possible and reveal the dramatic global consequences that followed. What does it take for life to completely remake a world? For millions of years, the continents were a canvas of rock and dust. This was the world of the Silurian and early Devonian periods, a starkly different planet from our own. Life clung to the water's edge, a thin green border along coastlines and riverbanks. Here, you would find mats of algae, cushions of moss, and the earliest pioneers of the land, tiny, simple plants that lacked true roots or proper leaves. They were more like living carpets, hugging the damp ground for moisture. Beyond these narrow, wet zones, the interior of the continent stretched out in vast, empty expanses. There were no forests, no grasslands, not even a proper layer of soil as we know it. Wind swept unimpeded across bare stone, carving the landscape and carrying immense clouds of sediment. Without roots to anchor it, the very ground was unstable, constantly shifting and eroding. This was a silent world, dominated by the raw geological forces of weather and erosion. The air itself was different, with levels of carbon dioxide far higher than today, creating a hothouse climate. The stage was set, barren and waiting for a revolution. The question was, what could possibly take hold in such an inhospitable place and change everything? The revolution began with a simple but profound biological breakthrough. For those early plants, survival on land was a constant struggle against two relentless forces, gravity and drought. They could not grow more than a few inches tall because they had no internal plumbing. Water and nutrients could only move from cell to cell, a painfully slow process that severely limited their size and shape. Then, evolution engineered a solution, a network of microscopic tubes we now call vascular tissue. Think of it as the world's first internal plumbing system. These hollow, reinforced cells acted like tiny straws, allowing water to be pulled up from the damp soil and sugars to be distributed down from the areas that captured sunlight. This one innovation changed the rules completely. For the first time, plants could defy gravity. They could grow upward, reaching for the light, and in doing so, they began to create their own environment, casting shade and trapping moisture below. But a tall plant needs a strong anchor. The next critical step was the evolution of true roots. Earlier structures were little more than shallow holdfasts. True roots delved deep, gripping the rock and soil with a tenacious hold. They did more than just anchor the plant. They became sophisticated mining operations, breaking down minerals and drawing up water and nutrients from depths previously inaccessible. This created a stable foundation, literally turning the unstable, shifting ground into a place a large organism could call home. With a plumbing system and a solid foundation, the stage was set for an explosion of form. The next leap was the leaf. Early stems were bare and efficient, but the evolution of flat, broad surfaces for capturing sunlight supercharged the process of photosynthesis. More leaves meant more food, which meant more energy for growth and reproduction. Finally, the development of seeds provided a survival package, a tiny plant embryo wrapped in its own food supply and protected by a tough coat, capable of waiting for the perfect conditions to sprout. Each of these adaptations, vascular tissue, roots, leaves, and seeds, was not just a minor tweak. They were revolutionary keys that unlocked entirely new ways of living. They transformed plants from passive inhabitants of the land into active engineers, capable of building complex structures and, ultimately, entire ecosystems. But possessing the tools is one thing, using them to build a new world is another. What did the very first attempts at a forest actually look like? The first tangible clue to this ancient world is not a towering petrified trunk, but a collection of small, flinty stones found in a Scottish field. This is the Rhynie Chert, a time capsule of astonishing clarity from the early Devonian period, around 410 million years ago. It was not formed by typical fossilization. Instead, a hydrothermal event, a system of hot, mineral-rich springs, flooded a low-lying wetland. The water was saturated with silica, which is essentially dissolved glass. This silica permeated everything it touched, seeping into the cells of plants, around the bodies of tiny arthropods, and into the spaces in the damp soil. It hardened with incredible speed, creating a perfect three-dimensional snapshot of an entire ecosystem. To study the Rhynie Chert, scientists slice it into wafers thin enough to be translucent and examine them under a microscope. What they see is not an impression or a carbon film, but the actual cellular structure of organisms that lived over 400 million years ago, preserved in gem-like detail. Here we meet some of the earliest vascular pioneers, plants like Rhynia. They were simple, leafless stems, rarely more than a foot tall, branching like a tiny, naked fern. They possessed that crucial internal plumbing, allowing them to stand upright, but they were still inhabitants of a perpetually wet world, their bases often submerged in the silty water of the hot spring environment. This was not a forest, it was a marshland community of diminutive forms, a world on the very cusp of monumental change. The Rhynie Chert shows us the toolkit was assembled, but the grand construction had only just begun. Yet the Rhynie Chert captures only the very beginning of the story. For the next chapter, we must leap forward in time, to the middle of the Devonian period, where a biological revolution was quietly taking shape. This is the era of the Progymnosperms, a group whose very name means primitive seed plants, and they represent the crucial missing link in our story. They combined the ancient and the modern in a single organism, a fusion that would change the face of the planet. In their method of reproduction, they were like ferns, relying on spores released into the wind or water. But in their architecture, they were something entirely new. They possessed the ability to produce true wood. This is the monumental shift. Wood is not just a substance, it is a structural material. It is built from a polymer called lignin, which acts like a natural reinforced concrete, providing immense strength and rigidity. For the first time, life had evolved a way to build tall, self-supporting towers. And the master architect of this new design was a plant called Archaeopteris. Archaeopteris was unlike anything that had come before. It was not a collection of simple stems in a marsh. It was a tree. Its trunk was made of solid wood, capable of growing to impressive heights, perhaps as tall as a modern three-story building. It had a deep, complex root system that anchored it firmly and helped create stable soil. Most strikingly, its branches were covered not with needles or broad leaves, but with fronds that looked remarkably like the fronds of a fern. Imagine a tall pine tree, but instead of clusters of needles, its branches were adorned with delicate, green fern-like foliage. This was the blueprint for the first real forest. Archaeopteris did not just grow in isolated patches, it formed dense, extensive stands. It was the first organism to truly engineer its environment on a grand scale, casting deep shade, moderating local humidity, and with its falling foliage, beginning to build the rich, organic layers of true forest soil. The world was no longer a place where plants simply existed. It was becoming a place that plants built, and with this new power came consequences that would ripple across the entire globe. For decades, the town of Gilboa, New York, was famous for little more than its quarry. But in the late 19th century, workers digging a foundation for a new schoolhouse unearthed something extraordinary. They found not bones but a forest of stone, a petrified landscape of enormous, flared stumps still anchored in the ancient soil. These were the Gilboa stumps, and they became the first physical proof that a true forest had once stood on our planet. The stumps, belonging to trees named Wattieza and Archaeopteris, date to the Middle Devonian period, around 385 million years ago. They were massive, some over 3 feet wide, with sprawling, horizontal root systems that spoke of stability and permanence. This was no marsh of simple stems. This was an ecosystem built on height. For a long time, however, the stumps were a mystery without a crown. Scientists could see the foundations of this ancient forest, but they had no idea what the tops of these trees looked like. The breakthrough came much later when fossil hunters found the missing pieces, fern-like fronds that perfectly matched the stumps. The picture that emerged was of a strange and primitive canopy. These early trees would have looked like giant, woody ferns, their tall, slender trunks topped with a bushy crown of green, feathery foliage. They grew close together, their roots intertwining to create the world's first stable forest floor. The air beneath this canopy would have been still, humid, and deeply shaded, a completely new kind of environment on Earth. This was the prototype, the first working model of a forest. Yet for all its innovation, it was still a simple design. The trees reproduced with spores like ferns, which limited how far and how fast they could spread. The forest at Gilboa was a monumental achievement, a glimpse of the green future. But it was not yet the engine that would transform the world. That power would come from a tree that perfected the blueprint. Yet the true transformation did not begin with the famous, swampy jungles of the Carboniferous period. That era, with its giant dragonflies and towering scale trees, is often mistakenly celebrated as the dawn of the forest. In truth, it was the culmination, a later chapter of abundance built upon a far earlier and more fragile foundation. The Carboniferous forests were the first to achieve truly monumental scale, their fallen remains piling up over millions of years to create the vast coal seams that would one day power the industrial age. But they were not the pioneers. That honor belongs to a quieter, earlier revolution in the Late Devonian. This is when the scattered, experimental woodlands of places like Gilboa finally coalesced into something powerful enough to change the world itself. The shift was subtle at first, a gradual greening of the continents, but its effects were anything but quiet. As these early forests spread, they began to perform a new kind of planetary alchemy. Their deep roots broke apart bedrock, accelerating the creation of rich soils. Their towering canopies captured sunlight on an unprecedented scale, fueling growth and locking away carbon from the air. And with every fallen frond and decaying root, they pulled that carbon out of the atmosphere and buried it deep within the earth. This was a biological pump operating on a global scale, and it was about to trigger one of the most dramatic climate shifts in Earth's history. The planet was being actively cooled by its own newly evolved life. The Late Devonian world was a place of profound and accelerating change. By this period, the scattered experiments in tree building had converged into a powerful new reality. The essential toolkit was now complete: woody trunks for height, deep and complex root systems for stability and soil creation, and the revolutionary innovation of the seed, which allowed plants to colonize drier, more challenging environments far from water. These were not just separate adaptations, they were interconnected parts of a biological system. The deep roots supported the tall trunks. The tall trunks elevated a canopy of greenery that captured vast amounts of sunlight, and the seeds carried the blueprint for this entire system across the landscape. The result was the emergence of the first truly complex, multi-layered forests. For the first time in Earth's history, the land was not just sparsely vegetated, it was architecturally structured. Imagine walking into one of these ancient woodlands. Your feet would sink into a soft, spongy layer of decaying organic matter, the world's first true forest soil, built over centuries of fallen foliage. Above you, a canopy of Archaeopteris trees would filter the sunlight, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. In that shaded understory, smaller plants, early ferns, and other vegetation would have found a new niche to exploit, a cooler, more humid microclimate engineered by the trees themselves. This vertical stacking of life from the soil to the canopy created an explosion of ecological complexity. It provided new habitats, new sources of food, and new opportunities for the animals that were beginning to venture onto land. This is the pivotal moment, the true beginning of Earth as a green planet. The continents were no longer passive mineral landscapes. They were now active, living systems, breathing, growing, and fundamentally reshaping the very air we would one day breathe. But the ultimate proof of this global greening lies in one of the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth today. Far above the Arctic Circle, the islands of the Svalbard archipelago are a landscape of glaciers and barren rock, locked in a deep freeze for much of the year. It is the last place you would expect to find a forest, yet here, embedded in the cold cliffs, scientists have uncovered one of the most spectacular windows into the Devonian world. These are the Svalbard fossil forests, and they are not just a few scattered stumps. They are entire horizons of stone, dense layers of petrified tree trunks still standing upright, their roots frozen in the act of gripping an ancient soil. This is not a single event or a local curiosity. It is a fossilized landscape, a snapshot of a vast and mature ecosystem that once covered this part of the world. The dominant tree is our now familiar architect, Archaeopteris. Its woody trunks, some as wide as a person is tall, are packed together in a dense stand. Their root systems are expansive and complex, spreading out horizontally through the fossilized soil layer, creating a tangled mat that speaks of fierce competition for space and resources. This density is the critical clue. A few isolated trees could be an anomaly, a lucky grove in a sheltered valley, but a dense, crowded forest preserved across such a broad geographical area tells a different story. It tells us that by the late Devonian, this was not an experiment. It was the new normal. The Svalbard forests show us that Archaeopteris had become a global success, forming extensive, closed canopy woodlands across the supercontinent of Laurasia. This was a fully realized green world, operating at a scale powerful enough to leave its mark on the planet's very chemistry. The stage was now set for the final and most dramatic act of this biological revolution. The transformation of the air was a global event, but the real work happened in the dark, in the quiet world beneath our feet. While the towering canopies of Archaeopteris captured the sunlight, a silent and equally profound revolution was unfolding underground. The evolution of deep, complex root systems did more than just anchor these first trees. It initiated the creation of something the planet had never truly possessed before: rich, fertile soil. This zone of intense biological activity, where roots, rock, and microorganisms interact, is called the Rhizosphere, and its emergence was a game-changer for life on land. Before forests, the so-called soil was little more than a thin layer of broken rock and dust, unstable and poor in nutrients. It was a mineral substrate, not a living ecosystem. The roots of these new trees changed that completely. They acted as geological agents, physically prying apart bedrock with relentless pressure as they grew, a process known as weathering. This mechanical action created finer and finer particles, increasing the surface area for chemical reactions. But the roots were not working alone. They formed one of life's oldest and most successful partnerships, a symbiotic alliance with fungi called mycorrhizae. These fungal filaments, far thinner than any root, extended a vast web-like network into the surrounding soil, acting as a supercharged extension of the tree's own system. In exchange for sugars from the plant, the fungi mined the soil for essential nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, nutrients that were locked away in the rock and otherwise inaccessible. This partnership supercharged the breakdown of minerals, releasing a steady stream of fertility into the ground. As roots grew, died, and decomposed, and as fallen leaves from the canopy above accumulated, they added something entirely new to the mix: organic matter. This decaying plant material, woven through by fungal networks and broken down by other microorganisms, created a spongy, dark, nutrient-rich layer, humus. This was the birth of true soil, a living, breathing engine for nutrient cycling. It retained water like a sponge, preventing erosion and creating a stable, moist environment for further plant growth. Critically, this process also acted as a powerful carbon sink. As organic matter was incorporated into the soil and buried by new layers, vast amounts of carbon were pulled from the atmosphere and locked away deep in the earth. The rhizosphere became a new kind of planetary organ, one that didn't just support life, but actively cultivated it, setting the stage for ever more complex and abundant ecosystems to arise. But a forest is more than just trunks and roots. It is a living machine for capturing sunlight. The final, critical piece of this ancient engine was the leaf. For millions of years, the early pioneers of the land made do with bare, green stems or tiny, spine-like outgrowths called microphyls. These were simple, inefficient structures, offering little surface area to absorb the sun's energy. Then, in the Late Devonian, a new design emerged and spread with revolutionary speed: the megaphyll. This is the true leaf as we know it, a flat, broad, and highly branched structure, a vast solar panel woven with a dense network of veins. The evolution of the megaphyll was a game of geometry. By branching repeatedly and filling the spaces between veins with thin, photosynthetic tissue, plants could suddenly capture sunlight on a scale that was previously unimaginable. Think of the difference between trying to warm your hands over a single candle versus standing under the open sky on a sunny day. That is the leap in energy capture that the leaf provided. An Archaeopteris tree with its canopy of thousands of fern-like fronds was not just a tall plant, it was a power station. Each of those fronds was a factory, using sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars and, as a crucial byproduct, oxygen. This massive increase in photosynthetic surface area supercharged the entire system. Primary productivity, the total amount of organic matter produced by plants, skyrocketed. Forests were no longer just structures on the landscape. They became the most powerful biological engines the planet had ever seen, actively pumping gases into and out of the atmosphere with every ray of sun they absorbed. The world was now draped in a living, breathing, energy-harvesting skin, and the consequences for the global climate were about to become irreversible. The world's first forests had become a planetary thermostat, and they were about to turn down the heat. The key to this global cooling lay in two of their most fundamental innovations: wood and roots. Wood is built from lignin, a tough, carbon-rich polymer that is notoriously difficult for most organisms to break down. In the ancient seas, when algae died, their soft bodies decomposed relatively quickly, releasing much of their stored carbon back into the water and atmosphere. But when a massive Archaeopteris tree fell in those new forests, its lignin-heavy trunk resisted decay. Over centuries, these fallen giants, along with a constant rain of leaves and roots, piled up in wet, low-oxygen environments like swampy forest floors. Layer upon layer of this organic material was buried and compressed, slowly transforming into peat and, over geological time, into coal. This process, known as carbon burial, effectively took carbon that had been floating in the air as carbon dioxide and locked it away in the Earth's crust for millions of years. Simultaneously, the deep, extensive root systems of these forests were performing another kind of carbon capture. As roots pushed through bedrock and secreted acids to mine for nutrients, they dramatically accelerated the natural weathering of silicate rocks. This chemical weathering reaction is crucial. It pulls carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, using it to dissolve rocks, and ultimately washes the carbon ions away into the oceans, where they form limestone on the seafloor. Before forests, this process was slow, limited to the action of rain and weak acids on bare rock. With forests, it became a global, biologically supercharged pump. Every root was a tiny chemical factory, actively pulling carbon dioxide from the air and sequestering it. The combined effect of these two processes, massive carbon burial on land and accelerated weathering by roots, was staggering. Over the span of the Late Devonian, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are estimated to have plummeted, possibly by as much as 90%. The lush, green world the forests had created was now triggering its own climatic crisis. The hothouse Earth of the early Devonian was rapidly cooling, spiraling toward an ice age. This dramatic shift did not happen in isolation. The consequences rippled through every ecosystem on the planet. The most severe impacts were felt in the oceans, where many forms of life had evolved over millions of years in warm, carbon dioxide-rich waters. As the planet cooled and the chemistry of the seas changed, vast areas of the ocean interior likely became oxygen-poor, creating deadly zones for marine life. The fossil record shows a series of sharp declines during this period, particularly affecting the spectacular coral reef communities and many groups of shelled organisms. It was one of the 5 great mass extinction events in Earth's history, and its primary driver appears to have been the success of life on land. This is the profound and sobering irony of the story. The very adaptations that allowed plants to conquer the continents, their wood and their roots, unleashed a geochemical revolution that reshaped the global climate and inadvertently caused a major crisis in the marine world. The forests were not merely inhabitants of the planet, they had become its most powerful geological force, capable of altering the air and the climate for all life, including themselves. The profound changes wrought by the forests were not confined to the air. They were etched directly into the very skin of the planet. Before this greening, Earth's landmasses were in a state of constant, violent flux. Without roots to bind it, the ground was little more than loose sediment, vulnerable to every gust of wind and drop of rain. Torrential downpours would carve deep, raw gullies into the bare rock, washing entire hillsides of silt and sand into the rivers in sudden, catastrophic pulses. These rivers ran thick with mud, dumping their heavy loads into the oceans in vast, choking deltas that shifted shape with every major storm. Coastlines were dynamic and unstable, and the shallow seas near shore were often turbid, cloudy with suspended sediment that blocked sunlight and smothered the seafloor. It was a world shaped primarily by geology, where the forces of erosion worked unimpeded. The rise of the forests introduced a powerful new force, biology, to this equation. The most important tool was hidden from view, a sprawling, tangled web beneath the surface. The complex root mats of Archaeopteris and its contemporaries acted like a planetary scale net. They physically gripped soil particles, weaving them together into a cohesive, stable structure. This living mesh dramatically slowed the movement of water across the land. Instead of sheeting off rapidly and carving channels, rainwater was now intercepted by leaves, absorbed by thick layers of decaying litter, and slowly infiltrated into the ground, held by the sponge-like organic soil the roots helped create. Erosion did not stop, but it changed from a catastrophic, rapid process to a slow, managed trickle. This stabilization had cascading effects on every river and coastline. Rivers, no longer choked with sudden pulses of silt, began to run clearer and deeper. Their flows became more consistent, fed by the steady release of groundwater from forested watersheds. With less sediment being dumped at their mouths, the great deltas began to change. They became more stable, their shapes evolving more slowly, allowing complex networks of channels and marshes to develop. In the oceans, the clearer coastal waters meant sunlight could penetrate deeper, revitalizing shallow marine habitats and allowing new ecosystems to flourish on the seafloor. The forests, by simply holding the ground in place, had begun to regulate the planet's water and sediment cycles. They transformed the landscape from a scene of raw, geological power into a more gentle, biologically moderated world, setting the stage for the next chapters of life's story to unfold in newly calm and fertile environments. But the revolution needed a final, portable key to unlock the entire continent. The early forests we have explored, for all their towering majesty, faced a profound limitation. They relied on a delicate, water-bound stage for the most critical act of all, reproduction. Plants like Archaeopteris and the trees of Gilboa reproduced with spores, microscopic packages that are astonishingly simple and equally fragile. A spore is a single cell containing the bare genetic blueprint for a new plant, but it carries no food supply and has no protective coat. To succeed, it must land in a place that is perpetually damp, and it must germinate immediately. The new plant that sprouts is also incredibly vulnerable, a tiny, thread-like structure that must remain wet to survive. This entire life cycle, from spore to mature tree, was chained to the water's edge, to swamps, riverbanks, and humid floodplains. It was a brilliant strategy for a wet world, but it placed a strict geographical fence around the forest's expansion. The vast, drier interiors of the supercontinents, the rolling uplands and seasonal plains, remained out of reach, a promised land that the spore could never reliably colonize. Then, in the Late Devonian, evolution engineered a masterpiece of biological packaging, the seed. Think of the difference between sending a single, unshielded letter through a storm and shipping a fortified survival capsule. A seed is not a single cell, it is a complex, multi-layered system. At its heart is the embryo, a miniature plant already partially developed. This embryo is wrapped in a nutritious food supply, a packed lunch to fuel its first critical days of growth. And the entire package is encased in a tough, protective coat, a shell that can resist drying out, temperature swings, and even digestion by animals. This design changed everything. A seed could wait. It could lie dormant in the soil for months or even years, biding its time through drought or frost, only germinating when conditions were finally perfect. It could travel. Its tough coat allowed it to be carried by wind, washed along by floods, or even transported in the gut or fur of an animal, far from its parent tree. Most importantly, it freed the plant from the tyranny of constant moisture. The seed carried its own water supply in the form of stored food, and its protective shell prevented the delicate embryo from drying out. This one innovation demolished the last great barrier to the greening of the planet. Now, the descendants of those first forest architects could send their offspring uphill, into seasonal climates and across vast distances. The colonization of the continents shifted from a slow creep along waterways to a rapid, unstoppable march. The age of the spore was giving way to the age of the seed, and with this new reproductive power, the green blanket of the forests was poised to spread over nearly every inch of habitable land, weaving the continents into a single, interconnected, living skin. The most intimate portrait of this ancient world was not found in a quarry but buried beneath a quiet town. In the foothills of the Catskill Mountains near Cairo, New York, researchers made a discovery that changed our understanding of these first forests. While examining an old road cut, they found not just a few fossil stumps, but an entire fossilized landscape, a snapshot of the forest floor exactly as it was 385 million years ago. This was not a slow burial by sediment. The site reveals a moment of sudden, violent preservation. Evidence suggests an ancient earthquake, perhaps triggered by the collision of tectonic plates that were building the Appalachian Mountains, caused a large section of low-lying forest to suddenly drop, to subside below the water table. In an instant, the ground was flooded, and a layer of fine silt and sand rushed in, entombing the entire underground network of roots before they could rot. It was a geological flashbulb, freezing the forest in place. What the silt preserved is nothing short of miraculous. The rock surface, which scientists can carefully clean and study, looks like a sprawling, petrified blueprint. Etched across an area the size of several football fields are the intricate, overlapping root systems of countless Archaeopteris trees. You can see the main taproots, thick and sturdy, diving deep into the ancient soil. Radiating out from them are lateral roots, branching again and again into finer and finer filaments, creating a dense, tangled web. This is the hidden architecture of the forest, the underground engine normally lost to time. The Cairo site provides an unprecedented map. By tracing these root systems, scientists could literally measure how close together the trees stood. The patterns show a densely packed community, with root networks fiercely competing for space and resources, often growing within inches of each other. This density is the definitive proof. It confirms that these were not scattered, open woodlands, but closed canopy forests where the crowns of the trees would have touched, creating a continuous green roof over the land. The scale revealed at Cairo is staggering. The mapped root systems cover such a vast area that researchers could confidently extrapolate the forest's extent. They concluded this was not a small grove, but part of a forest that likely stretched for miles in every direction. For the first time, we have direct, physical evidence of the sheer biomass of these ecosystems. The incredible density of roots meant an equally incredible density of trunks and leaves above. This was a mature, thriving, and complex biological factory operating at full capacity. The Cairo forest floor is the ultimate confirmation of the silent revolution. It shows us that by the end of the Devonian, the green planet was not a future possibility, but a present, sprawling, and dominant reality. The continents were now clothed in a living skin so extensive and so powerful that its next act would be to breathe a new atmosphere into the world. A forest is never just a collection of trees. It is a network of relationships, a symphony of interactions between countless different forms of life. The rise of Archaeopteris and its kin did more than change the landscape. They built the world's first complex apartment building, and they quickly filled it with tenants. This was the birth of the terrestrial ecosystem, a web of life on land that had never existed before. The architects had finished the structure, and now an entire community moved in. The first and most critical residents were not animals but fungi. Beneath the soil, the vast mycorrhizal networks we discussed earlier were doing more than just feeding trees. They were the original recyclers, the decomposition crew that broke down fallen leaves, dead roots, and woody debris. Without these fungal partners, the forest floor would have quickly become a tangled, impassable graveyard of undecomposed plant matter. The fungi unlocked the nutrients trapped in that dead material, returning them to the soil so the living trees could use them again. This created a closed-loop system, a cycle of life, death, and rebirth that made the entire forest more efficient and sustainable. But the fungi were not working alone. Joining them were the earliest soil microbes, bacteria, and other microorganisms that further processed organic matter. Together, this hidden, bustling society beneath the ground turned waste into wealth, fueling the growth of the forest from below. It was the essential foundation for everything that came next. With a stable food source now established in the form of living plants, decaying matter, and the fungi themselves, the stage was finally set for animals to make a permanent home on land. The first pioneers were arthropods, the ancient lineage that includes insects, spiders, and millipedes. Fossil sites like the Rhynie Chert show us these early inhabitants. You would have seen tiny, spider-like trigonotarbids scuttling through the damp litter, possibly preying on even smaller creatures. Millipedes, some of impressive size, navigated the understory, their many legs carrying them through the decaying vegetation where they likely fed on rotting plant material and fungi. These were not the giants of later periods, but they were the vanguard, the first consumers in a brand new food web. They filled brand new roles, predator, detritivore, herbivore, that had never existed in terrestrial ecosystems. Their presence, in turn, created new evolutionary pressures. Plants that could deter hungry arthropods with tough leaves or defensive chemicals had a survival advantage. This is the essence of co-evolution, a dance of adaptation and response, where the success of one life form shapes the evolution of another. For the first time, life on land was not just surviving in isolation. It was interacting, competing, and cooperating in a dynamic and interconnected community. The quiet forest floor was becoming a busy, vibrant world, and every new relationship made the entire system more resilient and more complex. The green planet was no longer silent. It was alive with the rustle of unseen lives, building a future together, one interaction at a time. Yet the story of this transformation was not confined to the northern lands. While the forests of New York and Svalbard were flourishing, an identical revolution was unfolding on the opposite side of the ancient world. The southern supercontinent of Gondwana, a vast landmass that would one day become South America, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, was undergoing its own profound greening. For decades, the narrative of the first forests was largely written from fossils found in Europe and North America, the remnants of the old continent of Laurasia. This created a lingering question: was this a local event, a lucky accident in one part of the world, or was it a truly planetary shift? The answer lay buried in the rocks of modern-day Brazil and Bolivia. In remote outcrops and quarries, paleontologists have uncovered stunning evidence, fossilized trunks and root systems of late Devonian trees that are strikingly similar to their northern cousins. The species might differ slightly as life adapted to local conditions, but the blueprint was unmistakably the same. Here were trees with robust woody trunks and deep, complex root mats preserved in dense stands. They were not isolated specimens, but the remains of extensive forest ecosystems. This parallel discovery is the final, definitive piece of evidence. It tells us that by the closing chapters of the Devonian period, the biological innovations of wood, roots, and seeds had achieved a global conquest. The forest was not a regional experiment, it was a planetary strategy. From the frigid latitudes near the ancient poles to the warmer heart of the supercontinents, the same fundamental architecture of life had taken hold. Earth, for the first time in its 4.5 billion-year history, was consistently and undeniably green. The continents were no longer separate geological entities with isolated pockets of life. They were now woven together by a common biological fabric, a living network that was actively regulating the planet's atmosphere, climate, and soil. The age of the barren rock was over. The age of the forest and all the complex life it would one day support had truly begun. But the story does not end with the quiet triumph of Archaeopteris. The stage it built would soon host a spectacle of unimaginable abundance. The Carboniferous period, spanning from about 359 to 299 million years ago, is often called the Age of Coal. It is famous for its vast, steamy swamps, its giant dragonflies with wingspans like hawks, and its towering, scale-barked trees. For a long time, this era was mistakenly seen as the dawn of the forest. We now know it was not the beginning, but the glorious, overflowing climax. The Carboniferous was the inheritance, the direct result of the biological and geological groundwork laid during the Devonian Revolution. The world was now primed for a green explosion. The atmosphere, stripped of so much carbon dioxide, was rich in oxygen, perhaps reaching levels of 35% compared to today's 21%. This supercharged air may have fueled the evolution of giant insects and allowed for more intense combustion, but its greatest effect was on the plants themselves. The continents, stabilized by deep root systems and covered in rich soil, provided a stable foundation, and the global climate, though cooling, was generally warm and humid, creating perfect conditions in the tropical belts for wetland ecosystems to thrive on an unprecedented scale. This was the payoff, the moment when the planet's new green machinery reached its maximum output. The stars of this new world were not the seed-bearing Progymnosperms, but their ancient cousins, plants that had perfected the spore-based lifestyle in the ultimate wet environment. Towering lycophytes like Lepidodendron rose over 150 feet tall, their trunks patterned with diamond-shaped leaf scars that made them look like giant, scaly columns. Their relatives, the giant horsetails known as calamites, formed dense thickets along waterways, their jointed stems rising like bamboo made of green glass. These plants were evolutionary holdovers in one sense, still reliant on water for reproduction, but they were masters of their domain. They grew with astonishing speed in the perpetually wet, nutrient-rich swamps. And here, the final act of the Devonians' carbon burial process went into overdrive. When these giants fell in the oxygen-poor waters of the swamp, their lignin-rich bodies resisted decay. Layer upon layer of this organic matter accumulated, compressed under its own weight and by new layers of sediment over millions of years. This was not just leaf litter, it was the literal mass of entire ecosystems, piled up and transformed into the vast coal seams that would one day power human industry. The Carboniferous coal swamps were not the first forests. They were the first forests to achieve such monumental productivity that they could literally bury themselves and change the geological record. They were the lush, extravagant finale to the quiet, revolutionary work that began with a simple network of tubes in a stem and a root-gripping bare rock. They show us what happens when a planet, once barren, finally learns how to be green. The story of this transformation is not just written in stone, it is stamped with a precise date. To understand the true pace of this planetary shift, we must move beyond the fossils themselves and examine the very rock that entombed them. The timeline of the greening is pinned down through a powerful combination of detective work, one method reading the absolute age of the rock and another reading the relative sequence of life within it. The first is radiometric dating, a technique that acts as a geological clock. In places like the fossil forests of New York and Svalbard, scientists do not date the petrified wood directly. Instead, they search for layers of volcanic ash that are interbedded or sandwiched between the fossil soil horizons. This ash fell from ancient eruptions, and within its crystals are tiny amounts of radioactive elements like uranium that decay into lead at a known constant rate. By measuring the ratio of uranium to lead in these pristine crystals, geochemists can calculate the exact moment that ash solidified, giving a precise age for that layer in the cliff face. If a fossil forest lies directly below a layer dated to 385 million years ago, we know the forest is at least that old. This provides the hard numbers, the absolute anchors in deep time. But a single date is just a point on a map. To chart the entire journey, scientists use a second method called biostratigraphy. This relies on index fossils, which are species that evolved quickly, spread widely, and existed for only a short, defined period. For the Devonian, some of the most sensitive index fossils are not giant trees, but microscopic spores. These tiny, durable casings are produced in vast numbers by the plants themselves and are scattered by the wind, often preserved in rocks where larger fossils are absent. Paleontologists have meticulously documented the succession of spore types through the Devonian rock layers. Each distinct assemblage acts like a unique signature for a specific slice of time. When they find the same spore signature in a rock layer in New York and another in Belgium, they can confidently correlate those layers, confirming they were formed during the same geological moment. By combining these two methods, the story comes into sharp focus. Radiometric dating provides the exact year, like a timestamp on a photograph. Biostratigraphy, through spores and other fossils, allows us to arrange all the photographs in the correct order, from the earliest marshlands of the Rhynie Chert to the towering, dense forests preserved at Cairo. Together, they reveal that the critical transition from a barren world to a green one was not a slow, gradual creep. It was a remarkably rapid revolution, geologically speaking, concentrated in the latter part of the Devonian period. This precise chronology shows us that once the biological toolkit was assembled, the transformation of the continents unfolded with a speed and finality that reshaped the destiny of our planet. Yet this global transformation was not a single, synchronized event. The fossil record reveals a more complex and fascinating truth. Earth did not turn green everywhere at once. Instead, the continents greened in a patchwork, a mosaic of advanced forests and primitive landscapes that persisted side by side for millions of years. While dense stands of Archaeopteris were casting deep shade in what is now New York and Svalbard, other parts of the world remained trapped in an earlier chapter. In some regions, particularly in the drier interiors of the vast supercontinents or in areas with less stable climates, the older, simpler plant communities held on. Here, you might still find vast stretches of low-lying, mossy wetlands or barren floodplains where only the hardiest, small-stemmed pioneers could survive. This patchwork was dictated by the local rules of climate and geography. A mountain range could create a rain shadow, leaving one valley lush and the next arid. The proximity to an ancient sea could provide the constant humidity needed for spore-based trees to thrive, while an inland plateau experienced harsh seasonal droughts that only seed-bearing plants could eventually tolerate. This meant that for a long stretch of the Devonian, a traveler journeying across the supercontinent could witness the entire evolutionary story of plant life unfolding across the landscape, from bare ground to marshland to towering forest, all within a single lifetime. It was a world of stark contrasts where biological time moved at different speeds in different places. The revolution was real and unstoppable, but it advanced like the tide, filling some bays and inlets long before it covered the entire shore. This uneven spread had profound consequences, creating isolated pockets of innovation and refuge that shaped the diversity of life for eons to come. This dynamic relationship between forests and climate was a two-way street, a conversation with profound consequences. The very success of the forests in cooling the planet introduced a new and powerful limiting factor, one that could halt their own advance. As atmospheric carbon dioxide levels plummeted and global temperatures fell, the world began to transition from a universal hothouse to a planet with distinct climate zones. The lush, wet conditions that favored the early spore-based trees, especially in the tropical regions, began to contract. In higher latitudes and continental interiors, where seasonal dryness or cooler temperatures became more pronounced, the expansion of these first forests hit a wall. They had engineered a world that was, in some places, becoming too cold or too dry for their own particular biology. This created a fascinating push and pull in the greening of the continents. The forests were not marching forward in an unstoppable, uniform wave. Their spread was a dance with the climate they were actively changing, advancing in some areas while retreating or stalling in others. It was a dynamic equilibrium, a constant adjustment between life and its environment. The path to a fully vegetated world was not a straight line on a graph, but a series of pulses and pauses, expansions and contractions, driven by this intricate feedback loop. The falling carbon dioxide levels that triggered global cooling also had a direct physiological impact on the plants themselves. Carbon dioxide is the essential raw material for photosynthesis, the very fuel for their growth. As the air grew thinner in this vital gas, the efficiency of their solar-powered factories decreased. This likely put a ceiling on maximum plant productivity and may have influenced the evolution of leaf designs to capture the gas more efficiently. So the narrative of an inevitable, triumphant green march is too simple. The reality was a complex and often precarious balancing act. The forests would cool the climate, which in turn challenged their spread, which then allowed carbon dioxide to slowly rebuild from volcanic outgassing, potentially warming the planet again and opening new territories for colonization. This seesaw effect meant that for millions of years, the extent of forest cover on Earth probably fluctuated, breathing in and out with the long, slow rhythms of the carbon cycle. The greening was a story of resilience and adaptation, not of unchallenged conquest. It reveals a planet where life was not just a passenger on a geological ride, but an active participant in steering the climate, sometimes navigating towards conditions that tested its own very limits. For all their breathtaking detail, the fossil forests we have discovered are mere fragments of a lost world. They are the rarest of snapshots, preserved only under perfect and catastrophic conditions. Think of trying to reconstruct the entire history of human civilization from a single buried city, a handful of shipwrecks, and a few time capsules sealed by volcanic ash. That is the scale of the challenge we face. The sites of Gilboa, Svalbard, and Cairo are extraordinary precisely because they are so exceptional. For every forest that was suddenly flooded, buried by silt, or preserved by mineral-rich springs, countless thousands simply rotted away, their stories erased by time and erosion. Between these brilliant flashes of preservation lie immense darknesses, gaps in the rock record that span millions of years and entire continents. These are the silent chapters in our story, periods where we simply do not know what the forests looked like or how they changed. One of the most tantalizing mysteries revolves around the leaf itself. We know the Megaphyll, the true broadleaf, evolved and spread in the Late Devonian, revolutionizing photosynthesis. But the exact sequence of its evolution remains blurry. Did it arise once in a single lineage and then spread to different plant groups? Or did it evolve independently multiple times as different plants experimented with flattening and branching their stems to capture more light? The fossil record has not yet given us a clear, step-by-step family album for this most vital of organs. We see the simple stems of the early Devonian, and then, relatively suddenly in geological terms, we see forests with complex fern-like fronds. The intermediate forms, the prototypes and experiments, are largely missing. Similarly, our understanding of the earliest forest animals is glimpsed through a keyhole. Sites like the Rhynie Chert show us a bustling community of small arthropods and fungi, but that represents one type of environment, a hot spring marsh. What creatures lived in the dense, shaded understory of the Cairo forest? What crawled up the trunks of the Svalbard trees or pollinated their strange, spore-bearing structures? The vast majority of these organisms were soft-bodied and left no trace at all. Their world, a world of rustles in the litter and unseen interactions in the canopy, is almost entirely silent to us. These gaps are not failures of science but reminders of its nature. Every discovery is a piece of a puzzle where most of the pieces are lost forever. Each new fossil forest is a miracle of circumstance, a message in a bottle from a green planet that was just learning what it could be. The most direct link to that lost world is not always found in the rock. Sometimes it is alive, growing quietly in a garden or a protected valley. To truly understand the forests of the past, scientists often turn to the present, to living relics whose biology has changed very little over hundreds of millions of years. These are not perfect replicas, but they are the closest analogues we have, offering a vital window into the physiology and ecology of ancient ecosystems. Among the most remarkable of these living fossils is the dawn redwood Metasequoia. For a long time, this tree was known only from fossils, a common component of northern forests from the age of dinosaurs. It was believed to be long extinct. Then, in the 1940s, a living stand was discovered in a remote valley in China. It was as if a dinosaur had been found wandering in a modern forest. The dawn redwood possesses a suite of primitive traits that make it an excellent model for understanding trees like Archaeopteris. It is a deciduous conifer, meaning it loses its needle-like leaves each fall. This suggests an adaptation to seasonal changes, perhaps to harsh winters or dry periods, a strategy that would have been advantageous in the fluctuating climates of the ancient world. Its wood is soft and fast-growing, and its branching pattern is relatively simple and orderly. By studying how the dawn redwood grows, how it manages water, and how it sheds its leaves, researchers can build computer models to test ideas about the growth rates and seasonal cycles of the first forests. Other living relics like the ginkgo tree or the woolly pine offer similar clues. The ginkgo, with its unique fan-shaped leaves and resilient nature, represents an ancient lineage of seed plants that has survived virtually unchanged. The woolly pine, discovered in an Australian canyon in 1994, is another botanical survivor from the age of dinosaurs. These trees are not direct descendants of Devonian species, but they are heirs to an ancient body plan. Their simple vascular systems, their reproductive strategies, and their overall architecture provide a functional blueprint. By observing these living fossils, scientists can move beyond the static shape of a fossil and begin to animate it. They can estimate how much water an Archaeopteris tree might have transpired into the air each day, how quickly it could have grown in a favorable season, and how its falling foliage might have built up the forest floor. These modern analogues breathe life into the stone, transforming a collection of petrified stumps into a dynamic, living engine. They remind us that the legacy of those first forests is not just buried in the ground, it is still growing all around us, a living connection to the moment Earth first learned to wear green. The stone itself carries a memory of that first great greening. Beyond the rare, exquisite fossils, the planet's very geology was rewritten by the roots and leaves of those ancient forests, leaving a permanent signature in the rock record for those who know how to read it. One of the most profound of these signatures is coal. The great coal seams of the Carboniferous period are not an accident. They are the direct, monumental consequence of the biological revolution that began in the Devonian. Those first forests introduced something new to the world, lignin, the tough polymer that gives wood its strength. For millions of years, as trees fell in the wet, low-oxygen environments of swamps and floodplains, their lignin-rich trunks resisted complete decay. They piled up layer upon layer, compressing under their own weight and being buried by sediment. Over geological time, this immense accumulation of organic matter was slowly cooked into peat and then into coal. The very existence of the first major, widespread coal deposits is a geological testament to the moment plant life became so productive, so abundant, that it could literally bury itself on a planetary scale. It is the fossilized energy of the first forests, locked away for 300 million years, but the forests left their mark on much more than coal. They changed the very nature of the sand. Before forests, sandstone formations tell a story of chaos. Rivers ran wild, carrying coarse, angular grains of sand and gravel that were dumped rapidly in thick, chunky layers. This sandstone is often what geologists call immature, poorly sorted, with grains of many different sizes all mixed together, reflecting the violent, unimpeded erosion of a bare landscape. After forests took hold, the sandstone changed. With roots binding the soil and stabilizing riverbanks, erosion slowed to a managed trickle. Rivers carried finer, well-rounded grains of sand, and they deposited them in thinner, more consistent layers that often show the delicate ripple marks of gentle currents. This shift in sandstone composition, from chaotic and coarse to orderly and fine, is a subtle but powerful signal in cliffs and quarries around the world. It marks the transition from a planet sculpted purely by rock and rain to one shaped increasingly by the quiet, persistent grip of roots. Perhaps the most elegant evidence, however, is written not in the shape of the rocks, but in their chemistry, in the subtle language of isotopes. Isotopes are different forms of the same element, atoms that have the same number of protons but a different number of neutrons, giving them slightly different weights. Scientists can analyze the ratios of these isotopes in ancient marine rocks, like limestone, which form on the seafloor. Two elements tell the story: carbon and oxygen. During photosynthesis, plants prefer to use the lighter isotope of carbon, carbon-12, over the heavier carbon-13. When forests exploded in the Late Devonian, they pulled enormous amounts of light carbon-12 out of the atmosphere and oceans to build their leaves, wood, and roots. When that organic carbon was buried as coal or soil, it left the oceans and atmosphere enriched in the heavier carbon-13. This shift is permanently recorded in the limestone of that era, a spike in the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 that lines up perfectly with the spread of the first forests. At the same time, the oxygen isotope record shifts. As global temperatures cooled due to the drop in carbon dioxide, the lighter isotope of oxygen, oxygen-16, became locked up in expanding polar ice caps. This left the oceans enriched in the heavier oxygen-18, another change stamped into the chemistry of seafloor rocks. Together, these isotopic signatures are a planetary fingerprint. They are not a single fossil or a local outcrop. They are a global geochemical event, a synchronized shift in the fundamental chemistry of the oceans and air that points to one cause: the rise of a green world. The forests did not just leave behind stumps and roots, they changed the very breath of the planet, and that breath is still frozen in the stone. The world built by those first forests was not an end point but a foundation. This profound greening of the planet did more than alter the climate and the soil. It fundamentally redirected the entire trajectory of life on Earth. Before the forests, the continents offered little to an animal. They were harsh, exposed landscapes with scarce shelter and even scarcer reliable food. An animal venturing out of the water would find a world of rock, dust, and perhaps a thin, damp mat of algae. Survival was a constant, desperate struggle against the elements, with no buffer and no bounty. The forests changed that equation completely. They engineered an entirely new kind of space, a three-dimensional world of unprecedented complexity and opportunity. The canopy became a new frontier, a green aerial realm of branches and leaves. The understory, now shaded and humid, offered a sheltered maze of stems and fallen logs. Most importantly, the forest floor, built from centuries of decaying organic matter, became a living larder. This was no longer just dirt. It was a rich, moist soil teeming with fungi, decomposing plant material, and the first small arthropods that fed on this abundance. For the first time, the land offered not just a place to be, but a place to live, with niches to exploit and resources to sustain a growing community. The forests created the very habitats that made a permanent move onto land not just possible, but advantageous. They provided the structure, the shelter, and most critically, the food web necessary to support larger, more complex life. The stage was no longer barren. It was set, furnished, and stocked for the next great act in evolution's play. The story of our greening planet is not just a history, it is a blueprint. This ancient narrative of biological innovation and planetary transformation holds profound implications far beyond our own world. It provides a powerful template for how we might one day detect life on distant exoplanets. The key lies in the concept of a biosignature, a measurable sign of biological activity, and Earth's own history offers the perfect case study. When those first forests spread, they did not merely change the landscape, they rewrote the chemical composition of the entire atmosphere. The dramatic drawdown of carbon dioxide and the corresponding rise in oxygen, locked into the rock record through isotopes, created a new kind of atmospheric fingerprint. This fingerprint is not a single gas, but a chemical disequilibrium, a mixture of gases that should not exist together in a stable atmosphere without a continuous, biological engine to maintain it. On a lifeless volcanic world, we might expect an atmosphere rich in carbon dioxide and methane, but not both coexisting with significant free oxygen for long, as they react and cancel each other out. A world with life, however, especially photosynthetic life, can maintain that improbable combination. Plants and algae constantly produce oxygen, while other biological processes release methane. The simultaneous detection of oxygen and methane, or oxygen alongside other reduced gases, in an exoplanet's atmosphere would be a tantalizing hint of a living world. Earth's Devonian transition shows us this is not a subtle signal. The greening was a planetary-scale event that left an atmospheric signature powerful enough to be theoretically detectable across interstellar distances with powerful future telescopes. The lesson is that life, when it becomes a dominant planetary force, does not just inhabit its world, it actively engineers its atmosphere in ways that physics and chemistry alone cannot explain. Our search for life elsewhere is in many ways a search for another world that has learned the same trick, a world whose air tells the story of a silent, green revolution. The journey from a world of bare rock to a planet draped in green reached its defining moment in the Late Devonian. From the frozen cliffs of Svalbard to the ancient soils of New York, the fossil forests stand as stone witnesses to that precise turning point. This was not simply the day plants grew taller. It was the moment life learned to build. With wood, roots, and leaves, the first forests assembled a new kind of planetary machinery. They became active engineers, stabilizing continents, creating rich soil, and pulling carbon from the air to cool the global climate. In doing so, they constructed something far greater than a collection of trees. They built the biosphere itself, a living, breathing, self-regulating system that has maintained the conditions for complex life for hundreds of millions of years. Every forest you walk through today is a direct descendant of that ancient revolution. The towering redwood, the whispering oak, the dense tropical rainforest, they all operate on the same fundamental principles first established by Archaeopteris and its kin. They are not passive scenery, they are active participants in a grand planetary cycle, still pulling carbon from the atmosphere, still creating soil, still regulating the flow of water. When we look at a modern forest, we are not just looking at trees, we are looking at the living legacy of Earth's greatest transformation, a legacy that continues to shape the air we breathe and the world we call home.